We're good.
You want me to start over or no?
We're good. Thank you, Dave.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Newt. I'm a new member to the commission. I'm taking longtime member Larry Brown. I'm taking his spot, he stepped down, and so I'm representing Milton, New Hampshire.
Don Hammond from Rochester.
Wayne Burton from Durham.
Drew Boudreau from Rochester.
Peter Nelson, Newmarket.
Barbara Holstein, Rochester.
Karen Golab, Milton.
Katrin Casper Lee.
Mark Richardson, Somersworth.
Mike Babinski, Summersworth.
Anna Sylvia, SRPC. Rachel Dewey, SRPC. Jen Sis, SRPC. Second to call folks on screen for commissioners, for voting members first. What do you want to call?
Dave Landry, Dover.
Review Ada Rollinsford.
Lisa Henderson, Newmarket.
For staff.
Hi, Megan Taylor Feder, SRPC.
Natalie Gemma, SRPC.
Jackson Rand, SRPC.
I believe that is everyone.
Okay. We only have one action item to start this out. Just all it is the approval of the September 8th, 2022 minutes, and get a motion on that from somebody.
Motion to approve.
Sounds like Don, I think.
Yes.
Second there somewhere. Is that Tom?
I'm seconding that, Dave.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Jen, do we need a roll call on this, or can we just do an aye?
We need a roll call.
Okay, I apologize. I forgot the person's name. That's all the way over to Don's side there.
John.
Newt votes yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes.
And to the screen.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes.
that's everybody. Thank you for that. And so let's move on to our major item, the needs assessment update. And Shana, Natalie, Rachel, Jackson, and Mark, I believe.
We're a whole crew of us. Basically half the staff. Yeah. Megan, can you promote Mark to a panelist? And Kyle, if you would like to be, otherwise he can stay in the attendee room. We will need Mark to be a panelist.
Okay, I sent them requests.
Okay, so give me a second. I'm going to share our presentation here. Oh, I couldn't present it the other day. That's okay. I think have to go. Oh, you're good. Oh. Megan, can you allow us to share our screen? Or make us a co-host?
Yep, I just made you co-host, so you should be able to do that.
Excellent. Okay. Okay, so the regional housing needs assessment has been a significant group project here in the office. And so just to kind of give you a bit of an overview of the team that's been working on this, we're each going to take a piece of sharing with you the content that is in the draft or some of the major findings that are in that draft. And so I only had one tiny little piece. I worked on the fair share piece, which we'll get to in a little bit. Shana has led our outreach efforts for the project. Rachel has led the data analysis piece, working with Jackson, who has undertaken all of the GIS analysis. as well as Mark, who has assisted on that data analysis component. And Natalie has been leading all the other parts of it. So we're each going to take a little portion of it and walk through what we sent out yesterday. And there's a handful of copies distributed around the table, is what we're calling our 90% draft. It might be more like 80, 85, but it's somewhere in that ballpark. So we wanted to take a moment before we got to the end to present our work to date to you and get some feedback on different aspects of the plan before we get to the final stages and post it for public review and comment. There's two components. There's the main document itself, which is the one around the table with a binder clip, or if you're looking at it online, it is the one that was simply the RHNA file. There's also a data snapshot companion to the regional housing needs assessment. That is much like you've seen our data team present before. It's very similar to the data snapshot, but really focused in on the elements that are included in the regional housing needs assessment. It provides additional detail and insight that is not in the main document itself. So with that, I think we're going to jump in and we're going to start going through the draft and presenting. There are a few things that you'll see in front of you on the table, or if you're online, we'll give you a quick alternative. You should have some red cards and green cards, yes and no. So we'll pose different questions throughout the conversation, and you can hold up the applicable card, and then we will pause to discuss further. But we want to get your take on certain things, and so this is a nice quick way to get across the room a nice visual of where you all are feeling about it. Feel free as we're presenting to be like, yes, I like this, or let's talk about it. There are also some blank index cards in front of you. These are for if you have a specific comment on something, if you have an answer that you don't want to share out loud, but you might want to write it down and give it to us, please use that index card. For those of you on Zoom, instead of a red card, please use the thumbs up icon in the emotions. Or if you're saying no, there is a shocked face in there. Please use the shocked face to say no. In lieu of an index card, please go ahead and share things in the chat. And our staff team will be keeping an eye on that as we go. So with that, let's jump into the presentation. Any questions so far? All right. I don't know. You tell me.
Sure. So we've presented some of the data along the way at various other meetings. And so instead of going through all of the data that's included in this plan, just some high-level overview numbers that we've talked about in the past. Housing units, the population is over 156,000 and increasing, aging. The average household size is declining. There's job growth in all of our communities, but the number of housing units is not keeping up with demand. The cost of housing is increasing, and there's really not a lot of housing available.
So jumping into a little bit more that you haven't seen thus far.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Mark. Like Jen said, I've been working with Rachel on a lot of the data component of our RHNA. Can everyone hear me all right?
Yes.
Great. So right off the bat, one of the things that really stood out to us was the Emergency Rental Assistance Program that was started in March of 2021. That's ERAP for short. For those of you who don't know, ERAP came from ARPA dollars and is administered by New Hampshire Housing. What's really shocking to us is that about $191 million has been spent on rent and back pay for families to pay back rent that had been delayed since the start of COVID. When you do the math, that's about $1,200 per renting household across New Hampshire. It was only meant to be a temporary program, but just this volume of applications speaks a lot. Outside of the winter months in the Stratford region, there's a pretty consistent amount of applications you'll see on that graph. It's not just for rent alone, it's also for utilities and maybe some other housing hardships that families are facing as a result of COVID. So that's why there's that spike there in the winter months. Unfortunately, since the program is ending, we would have otherwise anticipated another spike in those applications this winter, but they're actually tapering off right now because of the program ending. All in all, this is about 3,400 applications that were submitted from the Stratford region. And about 37% of those were from families with children, and about 18% were from households with a senior citizen. So overcrowding and overhousing is what happens when there's kind of a mismatch of space in a home and the number of people that live there. Obviously, that looks different for every family, and square footage is certainly one way to calculate that, but bedrooms is just a little bit more reliable and is more applicable to maybe families with children or roommates in an apartment, for example. The key takeaway here is that about 17.5% of renter-occupied households in our region are facing overcrowding, which would be when there are 2 more people than bedrooms available in a home. As I said before, that could be families who are struggling to find an apartment for their larger household, particularly single-parent households who are on a single income, most likely. And again, maybe some students in the Durham, Dover, Newmarket area. Overhousing, pretty common for empty nesters who may have bought a home 20, 30 years ago, raised a family, children have moved on. Now the couple has a 3, 4, 5 bedroom home. Maybe even later down the line, one of them passes away. Overhousing can actually be a burden on these households just because of things like property taxes, or it might be challenging to find a smaller home that might be more accessible to an aging person who's having some mobility issues. So to get into greater detail about the types of housing we have in this region, I'll pass it over to Rachel, but are there any questions so far?
Hearing none. So another way that we're looking at quantity of housing is looking at housing densities. And that's usually measured in units per acre, which is a little hard to wrap your head around if you don't have a good frame of reference of what an acre is. So we're trying to come up with ways to really illustrate that. So less than 0.1% of the acres in the region have more than 10 units per acre. So it's really not much of the region. We'll highlight a couple of examples, but 96.8% of the region has less than 4 units per acre. The 3 densest blocks in the region, 2 of them are in Dover. The new 120-something apartments in the Orpheum apartment building in Dover is a 2-acre block that comes out to about 62 units per acre. And then just around the corner on Central Ave, there's a block that is about 43 units per acre, and it's mixed use residential. So storefronts on the first floor and apartments on the second and third. And then the 3rd densest housing is condos in Newmarket, and those are 28 units per acre. So 10 units per acre can look like a lot of different things. It can be one big apartment building that's many apartments on the block and then not a lot of housing around it. It can be more condos. It can be a street with lots of single family houses close together. And it can be really old single family houses that have been converted to multi-family apartments. 8 units per acre can look kind of similar from the curve. More old single family houses that have been converted to multifamily. More single family houses with just a little bit more space in between. Residential neighborhoods like what you would see in most parts of Dover and Rochester. And then 4 units per acre is even more spread out, single-family homes with some small yards and some of the subdivision and newer neighborhoods that we're seeing built today. And then the majority of the region is 1 unit per many acres. The town of Brookfield comes out to an average of 31 acres per unit. So that's that green box with the little house in it. And then the picture here is actually a house in Northwood, but it is the best street view I could find with a big field and a house in the distance. So that, yeah, that's many acres for that one house. I can incorporate that to kind of illustrate what different densities look like. Oh, good.
So what's the point of the study of housing density? We're obviously a rural county. Just trying to get a handle on the numbers at this point in time to track in the future, or what?
So throughout the document, we're talking about different housing. Later in the document, we're talking about different housing needs and options for different communities for future development. And so this is to kind of set a baseline of what do we have already, and then what do these densities look like. So just saying we should have more of this level of density without kind of having a frame of reference of what that looks like. It's hard to say what's density.
I would say also understanding that each community has unique needs and that like the town of Stratford, we've done a lot of outreach there recently and like they don't want to be built up like, you know, Dover or Barrington. So, you know, being cognizant that each town has unique needs. And I'm going to point out 2 different things as well. So one, you know, something we hear through different outreach events that we've had and resources that folks aren't looking for a one-size-fits-all solution across the region. One of the things that is attractive about our region is that there are choices for the residents who live here. So those who want to live in a more rural area can. Those who want to live in a dense urban area can. And so it's, again, just using that to support that it's not one size fits all for all communities. Another point where this is going to come into play is at the very end of this presentation, where it'll all tie back together, where we start looking at the production model results for what our projected demand is for housing over the next 20 years. So that's going to come into play there.
I was just thinking there might be some correlation as well with how proximity to healthcare facilities for some people.
Oh, yes.
Proximity to shopping center, that kind of stuff
yes.
is happening as well beyond what we're seeing here.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Okay.
So in developing the RHNA, we identified a set of groups that face greater barriers to housing than others for any number of reasons. There's a lot of overlap just within these groups on the screen here and any number of the reasons they face housing challenges. Going back to high school stats for a second, we identified geographic concentrations of some of these groups just to see where they face greater housing challenges and where there's potential for improvement for those groups. So that's really what's on the high, above average outside of that main bell curve area. So here's 2 examples. Minority groups, as we know, it gets a little bit more diverse as we go further east and further south in the region. I'll give everyone a second to absorb this. I'm not sure how big it appears on the screen.
Not that big. So just in terms of key for those in the audience here, the lime green is the lowest population percentages, and then as you go up the gradient towards the purple is where you have the largest share of the population is a minority or has limited English proficiency, etc.
Yeah, it's actually quite readable for the online folks, I believe.
I make a
comment?
Yeah.
One of the main goals of New Hampshire is to get 65% of the population with post-secondary credential. We now sit at 48%. People without a post-high school credential seems to be a group that needs attention. And we don't include it as a variable.
That's a good point. And that's why we're here today.
Massachusetts is around 80%. Maine's about 52%. Vermont is somewhere in there. But it poses, especially with an aging population, it poses dilemmas for economic development if our workforce is not prepared.
Thank you.
Talked about aging populations quite a bit, and we also know that the number of families is declining a little bit, but here's just a distribution of those two key age groups and those with a disability. What's notable about those with a disability is that there is significant overlap with the aging population, as you'll see on this map. That one's actually not zoomed in. But there's concentrations in Farmington there, like right at the end of that coastline as well.
So next, we're going to talk about housing affordability. And first, we're going to look at the impacts that rising interest rates have had on housing affordability in our region. So as we all know, in an effort to combat inflation, the Federal Reserve has raised interest rates 6 times already since March of this year. And as a result, mortgage interest rates have also been impacted, which has made home buying obviously less affordable. So what this slide shows is an example of what those impacts are, which are summarized on this table. So what the table shows is with federal interest rates rising, they have resulted in mortgage interest rates for a 30-year loan to go from 3.1% in late 2021 to over 7% by the end of October of this year. And what this means, for example, for someone looking to purchase a $400,000 home with a 5% down payment and a 30-year loan is that they would be paying $926 more today than a year ago, just in principal and interest alone. In this scenario, their monthly payment at a 3.1% interest rate would be $1,623 versus $2,549 at today's interest rate. And this does not include taxes or homeowners insurance or PMI, or in the case of condos, it doesn't include any HOAs if applicable. Of course, this hike in interest rates is expected to slow the hot housing market, but by pricing home buyers out of the market even more, they're being pushed into what we know is an already strained rental market. Next slide, please. So here next we explore affordability by occupation, where we took a look at the salaries across 15 different sectors and what their max affordable rent and purchase price for housing is and how that compares to the 2022 median rent and purchase price in the region. So the first slide, the slide we're on right now, it shows affordability by occupation for a single full-time worker. So the bar shows the bars, they show what the max affordable purchase or rent prices are. And then the black horizontal line shows the median purchase or rent price for 2022. So looking at the left, we can see that out of all the occupations listed here, only engineers, registered nurses, and higher experienced electricians and police officers would actually be able to afford what we know is the max affordable rent in the region, which is just over $1,500 on their salary alone. And even more shocking, if you take a look at the chart to the right, that chart shows that none of the 15 occupations, no matter what the experience level is, would be able to afford the 2022 median sold price, which is around $360,000 on their salary alone. Next slide, please. So here we look at affordability by occupation again, but this time we combine the wages of 2 full-time workers in the same occupation. So to the left, we see that even the combined wages of 2 cashiers, childcare workers, fast food workers, and entry wage healthcare aides, janitors, salespeople, and waiters would still not be able to afford the 2022 median rent. And on the right, we see that out of the 15 occupations, only the combined wages of 2 engineers, registered nurses, and higher experienced police and electricians would be able to afford our median sold price for 2022. So in summary, what this all shows is that on a single income or even on 2 incomes sometimes, for many of the region's largest industries, it's just not enough to afford today's housing costs. Next slide, please.
I'm sorry, that's the median, not the mean.
Yes, that's the median.
Half of it is less and half of it is more.
Correct. Yes.
Yes.
The statement you just made, is that a fair statement? If the median is here and you're saying only engineers can afford that, but there's prices below that.
So,
Go back to the last chart. Not that one, but the one before.
go back to not being that.
So what you're saying is, this is based on a house that's 400,000.
Yes.
So there are houses for 200,000. So
And so
this slide only depicts the example of buying a house that's 400,000.
This is actually the
So-
median house price right now. So what we did is we took the middle house price and the middle income.
Yeah.
So half of the houses cost more, half of the houses cost less. Half of the people who make that or of that occupation make more, half make less. So we took the middle point for both the price of housing and the income. So in that sense, we're comparing apples to apples if you're at the middle.
But yeah, it's not to say that no one can afford any houses in the
Right.
region. It's just showing like at the median, right?
Could you read off? I can't read those.
Sure.
Those
I'll
categories, just for fun.
Rachel's gonna read it. It's on her screen. I have terrible eyes.
So it's assemblers, cashiers, childcare, construction, electricians, engineers, fast food, truck drivers, healthcare aides, janitors, office clerks, police, registered nurses, retail salespersons, and waiters and waitresses.
Where do public employees show up?
Due to the fact that there are hundreds of occupations in the region, we weren't able to include everybody on this.
Okay.
So we did go with 15 here, but we do have data on more. But for the purposes of these charts, we had to just pick some.
Did you have educators are in there somewhere? Teachers?
Childcare,
Childcare
but not
is,
educators. Yeah, we do have police.
so in the RHNA data snapshot that you got around the room, we neglected to print page numbers, but those charts are in there as well, if you want to see them up close.
And the only question I have is IT professionals included other engineers?
Yeah, I think probably we'll have to do a more in-depth, maybe interactive version on that we can scroll through everybody, but.
Okay. I mean, are there other professions that you would like to see that we haven't necessarily included? So you mentioned IT, you mentioned educators, public employees.
Well, trades are lacking employees now. Also.
I think the trades are fairly well
Okay.
covered. Anything else?
I can't see that. So maybe when I see it.
I would suggest you you try to put on the slide, the educator one, since the education and educators topic is seen in many of your other slides as fairly significant parts of pie charts and things like that. So that's probably the biggest one to try to fit in.
Okay. Okay. right, Natalie, ready to keep going?
Okay. So next we look at the conditions that are likely to impact future housing supply, affordability, and the cost of developing new housing. So I won't go through all of the ones that we have on the plan, but just to point out a few examples we have on here. For example, we look at how monetary policies and the rise in construction material and labor costs might result in a slowdown in real housing production and just general higher prices for housing. Or, for example, how for climate change, we look at factors such as flooding, extreme heat, droughts, and wildfires, how those could result in an influx of population due to what is known as climate migration, which would put more strain on our housing infrastructure and our community services. Or, for example, how extreme heat will have a greater impact on persons living in older or poorly insulated homes, which, as we all know, there is plenty in New England. Another example is examining how the fluctuation in student enrollment or just behaviors in college towns, in our case Durham, would have an impact on demand and availability for student housing in our region. So, for example, we know that enrollment at UNH has been declining. So we're thinking for the future what that means for our housing stock. Another way in which we're seeing this net right now through UNH is we know that they're soon going to be discontinuing the Wildcat Transit route to and from Newmarket, since student ridership has decreased so much due to students relocating to other more affordable parts of the region, specifically Dover is what we think. When many years ago, this was one of their busiest routes.
Yes.
Going back to that last slide. Just as I was listening, and earlier slides, I didn't notice it. Where's the connection with the infrastructure in both trends and maybe current housing density? It came up as you guys were beginning your presentation. It strikes me that that's an issue.
It is.
And again, you mentioned some communities, you don't want density, so they're good without extending sewer and water and roads. But that is a factor, I think, in probably either allowing housing to occur or not, both capacity, condition, and availability.
That's a really good segue.
Okay. You and I planned this.
Right, Jackson?
Exactly. I get a little something in my paycheck.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jackson Rand. I'm the GIS planner here at SRPC. And as part of the RHNA, we did a bunch of different GIS analyses, and there's 3 of them that I'm going to go over with you today. So this first one is a zoning analysis of the region. We went through the zoning ordinances of all the municipalities in our region to see where different types of residences can be constructed in the region. So the map that you're looking at on the left, all of the green space is where some type of residential use is currently allowed based on the zoning ordinances of each community. And all of the orange space is showing where no residential use is allowed whatsoever. And based on this analysis, we found out that almost 99% of the land in our region does allow for some type of residential use. Next slide, please. This map you're seeing on the left is showing where single-family residential use is allowed. So all of the dark green is where single-family housing is allowed. The light green that's mostly seen in Barrington is where single-family housing is allowed with conditional use permits. And the orange, which is primarily in Rochester and Dover, is where single-family housing is not allowed. Excuse me. And then all the gray is where there is no residential use allowed at all. So most of that gray is water or commercial and industrial areas. And we found that almost 90% of the land in our region allows for single-family housing.
What about
Next
the
slide,
land?
please.
Durham owns the university owns about half of Durham. They don't allow single-family uses. Is that, I can't see where Durham is on the map.
Yep, that's grayed out on Durham.
That's, okay,
Grayed out portion.
that's where I was, okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So now we're looking at two-family housing. Again, it's the same color scheme. All of the dark green is where two-family housing is allowed in the region. The light green, which is primarily found in Brookfield, Barrington, and Lee, is where two-family housing is allowed with a conditional use permit. And the orange is where two-family housing is not allowed, which is mostly seen in Brookfield, Rochester, Somersworth, Durham, and Newmarket. And nearly 80% of the land in our region allows for two-family housing.
Before we go to this next one, if you would like to see the maps a little closer up, they start on page 93, and the ones that Jackson is going over should be in the same order. Yeah.
And this is the last map for the zoning analysis. This is showing where multifamily housing is allowed in the region. Again, same scheme, dark green, which you can see in Wakefield, Farmington, Stratford, Nottingham, and Dover is where multifamily housing is allowed. The light green, which you can mostly see in New Durham, Northwood, Barrington, and Lee, is where multifamily housing is allowed with a conditional use permit. And the orange is where multifamily housing is not allowed, which is primarily seen in Brookfield, Middleton, Milton, Rochester, Somersworth, Madbury, Durham, and Newmarket. And so about 60% of the land in the Stratford region allows for some type of multifamily housing.
Sorry, what's the accommodation thing? What's that? It says,
The conditional.
yeah, what's conditional? What's
Oh,
that?
conditional use permit, it's a provision under zoning. There's either special exceptions or conditional use permits. That's where your zoning ordinance says maybe it's allowed, but you need to go through some additional tests. And so to get a special exception, if it requires a special exception, you have to go to the zoning board, prove that you meet certain criteria. If it's a conditional use, you have to go to the planning board and prove that you meet specific criteria. If you do meet those criteria, then yes, you are allowed. If you do not, then no, you are not.
Thanks, Jen.
Can I ask a question, or I guess it's more a comment? This is a really interesting slide because being from Newmarket, I was saying, wait a minute, we have a lot of multifamily housing, and in particular relative to some of the Stratford region. And I think probably what this just goes to show is that that in certain communities, the concentration of where multifamily housing exists can still ensure if the density is significant, then you can get the volume of multifamily housing, but perhaps in a smaller area, whereas probably that's not the conclusion to be made, looking at, say, Milton or Middleton, not picking on anybody, but that's just my suspicion. Does that seem accurate, Jackson and others?
Yeah, and I'll point out, especially for the people in the room who might not be able to see this, there are pockets, like looking at this map, it looks like there's nowhere in Milton, Somersworth, Durham, Newmarket, or Madbury that allows multifamily housing, but there are small pockets in those communities that do allow multifamily housing.
The other thing to keep in mind is that there is some of that type of housing in some of the communities. It's a very old area, and a lot of it's historical. So while it's not allowed, it was pre-existed, a lot of the zoning regulations. So it's there. Might not be able to put new in, but there's existing there.
Yeah, correct. This is just showing what the zoning ordinance is allowing for today, not what's actually on the ground.
Yeah.
Big deal. Durham just proposed a whole new zoning ordinance that allow use in areas where it's now prohibited. And it's drawing some negative because most people think when you go from prohibited to conditional use, you're increasing the density. And it's a big deal because most people feel that a conditional use permits will be granted eventually somehow. So it's not a small item now in Durham. I'm not sure about the other communities. But we're trying to expand housing options and there's been a lot of resistance to it Because just the change in that classification makes a huge difference in what can happen. I'm not saying it should or shouldn't, but it's not unimportant.
Yeah, and I would concur. And part of the reason that Jackson went through and did this GIS analysis is a tool for your communities. Under the state workforce housing law, all communities have to provide a reasonable and realistic opportunity for multifamily housing. So what does that mean? You know, it's going to depend on your community, but for you to be able to look and assess whether there's a reasonable and realistic opportunity, you need to have this kind of information so that you can look and then say, okay, well, you know, I have this area where multifamily is allowed. Let me zoom in and see what the existing land use is now in that area. Is it developed? Is it undeveloped? Is there the potential to do something there? And those are going to be some of the next slides that Jackson's
Jen, is
gonna
there any
show as well.
evidence that the state actually enforces that?
There is no proactive enforcement of that. The enforcement is reactive. So if you had an applicant come into your community looking to build multifamily and there was no reasonable and realistic opportunity where you have multifamily zoned and they said, I want a variance, and you said no, you could go to court. So that's how that's being enforced.
There's also a state law that says no town can put any ordinance in that discourages agriculture.
Correct.
But many towns do because of, including Durham, by the way, and no one enforces it. And that's a problem, I think.
Right.
Can you actually go back a slide, please? I'm going to pause here real quick before we go on. If everybody in the room could grab your green and red cards that are in front of you. And I'm wondering, for the community that you are representing, is any of this information a surprise to you? If it is a surprise, put up a green card. And if it's not surprising, hold up a red card. And if someone in the room can tell me what we're seeing.
We have all red cards, no surprises.
I like that.
Okay.
Thank you. Next slide, please.
The chat. Pause it there. So Lisa was shocked at Herb who said yes, surprise, green.
I guess I just thought Newmarket had a more expansive multifamily zoning, so.
Thank you. So the second analysis I'm going to go over is a developable land analysis. And so for this analysis, we took all of the land that is currently zoned to allow for some type of residential use. We subtracted out any current physical infrastructure. So anywhere that currently has residences built or transportation or impervious surfaces or utilities, all of that land was subtracted out. We then subtracted out conservation land. We took out wetlands, water, and steep slopes. And what we were left with is this purple layer that you see on the map. And this purple represents all of the space in the region that's currently zoned for residential use and physically can be built on. The only caveat here is this does not take into consideration frontage requirements or minimum lot sizes. And this doesn't take into consideration if there is transportation or utility infrastructure to access that land. So this is a very hypothetical analysis. But based on what we've done, we've found that about 50% of the land in the region is zoned for residential use, does not have residences built on it, and is land that could be built on. Next slide, please.
Can I ask you a quick question on that? Will you be getting through with a slide on minimum lot sizes?
Can you say that again?
Will you be getting to the slide on minimum lot sizes? Allowed?
No, There is a discussion of minimum lot sizes in the actual RHNA report, but not in this presentation.
I would suggest in some places it has an immense impact on what actually, as a practical matter, can happen.
Thank you.
Question in the room as well.
Jackson?
Yeah.
I didn't hear the word agriculture in excluded.
So most agriculture has its own zone in the zoning ordinance or is part of some sort of conservation-esque land. So that is not included in here.
It should be, right?
Well, that's a good question. So existing agriculture, so like the things that are currently used for agriculture, if it does not have an easement on it, it can be developed. And I know I worked previously in a community that was a very agricultural community. And one of the largest agricultural operators there said, I plan to, when I'm ready to retire, I plan to sell my farm and I may sell it to a developer. I'm going to sell it where I can get the most money for it.
But what's happening in Newfield right now is because when I was in the legislature, we passed a bill saying that if you had farmland, you could also have income producing activities.
Yes.
As long as as long as your agriculture exceeded 30% of your revenue. So there's a big question about whether a farm stand in Newfields can have rock bands and a bar and a restaurant at the same time, and the neighbors don't like it, but it's a big question now.
Yeah.
Because the law changed with regards to what is agriculture.
I guess the only thing I'm thinking is what you said, Jan, is true.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not gonna, succession plan for me is I'm gonna sell the farm. But I don't see that identified here. It may happen, but there's still that land that may stay agricultural.
Yeah, and that's the case here. I mean, some of this, like, this is not saying that every acre on this map will be developed for residential use. It's just saying that it could be.
Generally speaking, are you saying that there's probably more developable land than we think in this region? Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
But, so we're gonna go to the but. You ready to go, Jackson?
Yeah, I'm good.
This is Mike's question here, coming. All right.
So we then took this developable land analysis and looked at how much of that land currently has access to water and sewer infrastructure. So what you're seeing on this first map is developable land that currently has access to only water infrastructure. So connection to public water utilities or private water utilities. Next slide, please. This is showing developable land that currently has access to only sewer infrastructure. Next slide. And this is showing developable land that currently has access to water and sewer infrastructure. So while there's a lot of land, about 50% of the region, that could be developed, it's a much smaller percentage of the land in our region that could be developed and already has access to sewer and water infrastructure.
You're using developed as a to mean places that could have full residential facilities.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
We're concerned about housing people, right? So that's why we're doing this.
Correct.
How do you define access to water infrastructure? Because I'm seeing a lot more in Lee than I would ever guess.
Jackson? Access to
Yeah,
water?
so, yep. So these, all of the purple on the map are parcels. So if the parcel is located within 50 feet of current sewer or water infrastructure, then we assume that it has current access. So that could be a public water and sewer infrastructure or private water and sewer infrastructure, such as a condo association that has its own water and sewer infrastructure. So this is a very, very hypothetical scenario.
Yeah, and another issue, and it kind of affects both Rochester, I would say Berwick, but certainly Somersworth, with regard to our water supply in the Salmon Falls is, and I'm sure it's in, one of these charts in terms of buildable land in a certain part of Rochester and Somersworth area. But it's also areas that we're interested or talking about to avoid development for water quality. So it's this, I don't know how to quantify that. That's a challenge for those of us that deal with water supply issues. And it's a balance between trying to find out, promote appropriately, safely, and then deal with water supply.
Well, another way to look at that too is, there's a not easily determined, but finite amount of water that's available. So if you work backwards from there, you can say, how much can we develop based on how much per household water use we use? And then you can start looking at the details of how do we reduce water use. The important things that we can actually change and have something to do. So if you look at Stratford as a region, you can say we have X gallons of water available to us that are drinkable. How much can we really develop? Because to me, it would make sense to have environmental restrictions. I mean, we don't, we're not dependent on the Colorado River or the Hoover Dam drying up. It's a little bit different situation here, but there's no reason you can't have the same reasoning around that to say, we are not ever going to want to develop more than, we don't want to be importing water, or we're not going to be able to import additional water, or we're going to build a desalination plant, right? So there's a lot of ways to look at that where you completely reverse it around and say, what are some of the limiting factors? Another one that I think I'm kind of concerned, because this is overall really good delve into a lot of details and statistics, but I don't see anything so far about energy, and energy is very important. So I don't see anything that says how much of our housing stock is fed by fossil fuels, oil, gas, how many solar residential developments do we have? How much electricity do we use? Because that's going to be another limiting factor. If we're planning to move to a zero carbon consumption environment, that's going to be a limiting factor. And so if we're going to start building codes and stricter building codes, which are going to be more efficient buildings, tighter restrictions on what goes in, all electric, heat pumps, we might change building costs. How does that reflect on affordability? We already know one of the main things this entire study just points at. The bottom line is affordability, affordability, affordability.
Yeah.
All right. So we need to be looking at things that are going to impact affordability. Energy is a huge one right now, and it's on everybody's plate. Rising electric rates. What are we going to do about it? So when I look at these things, I always come back to the big, so what? We can look at questions, we can look at details, we can look at data, but in the end, it's the big, so what? What are we going to do about it? What can we do about it?
Yeah.
And I also look at it, the commissioners, 90, I don't know what the percentage is, but my guess is probably 90% of what we review every time we come into a meeting is strictly related around transportation. We don't even talk about these other things because we have no financial leverage on that. So the other important piece there is access. So when we sit around this table and are making decisions, we're making decisions on transportation projects. We should be looking at access. We've had meetings where we talked about access. So if we're looking at where is single family, where's denser residential, we should be looking at it as where is access adequate and where is access missing. And when we talk about access, it's all those important things like access to food, access to hospitals, access to schools, access to mass transit, the things that also make those properties developable, usable, desirable. And that's a huge one that when we sit here every day, that we're making decisions now. We have 5 projects that are going on the 10-year plan. We should be looking at that. Where's the housing aspect of that? I don't even think housing's on those when we look at those as transportation projects. Housing's not on there, nor is energy. So we keep missing 2 big buckets here all the time. That access one and that relationship to energy, which is going to drive a lot of things. And another one that we touched on a little bit, but I'd really be interested to see more detail is, rising sea levels and displacement. What are the displacement costs? And not just within our region, but, someday Miami's going to be underwater. Where's everybody going, right? So we need to look at it as, in migration from other regions and look at it from that 100-year perspective, not just the 10-year perspective, look at it from a long-term perspective. So I really think, sort of, keeping a mindset of sort of what I call environmental determinism. What are those limiting factors on growth? Rising temperature levels are going to impact agriculture around the world. Maybe not so much here, but I'm sure Jonathan Newt, as a forester, can talk to what temperature, and over time, we've seen change in forest habitat, other habitat in New England. All of those things are going to have important impacts. It's going to have important impacts on water resources, our ability to seek more water and energy resources. So I would keep that in mind. And like I said, we have a really good exercise in front of us of data collection. Let's make sure we start using it to do the, so what question and answer sessions.
The sewerage part on here is something that this area has to be very concerned about, because our permits coming down from EPA are being very strictly limited from the EPA because of the Piscataqua basin. I know that Rochester, the city is growing, but over time, the discharging permits are declining. So, how can you grow and still have a declining sewerage thing? I don't care how many people you put on septic systems, sooner or later, those septic systems get pumped out and they have to be dumped somewhere.
I'd like to chime in on that one too, because Cape Cod just passed, there's new legislation in Massachusetts, and Cape Cod is getting very strict on septic system design for nitrogen loads, and they're redesigning the standards of what you're going to have to put in for residential septic, with the price of an average septic system for residential now rising to $35,000 to get a nitrogen containing septic.
That's only in a certain amount of feet from the waterfront. I had a house down there and I had to put a new system.
Well,
it's not for every new house.
It's not every house. It's mostly within, like you said, a certain range of waterfront. But that's what we're looking at here. So that's the same kind of thing when we look at, we got 90-something% of land that's developable for residential. Well, how many of those are close to water bodies? That's at some point, when are we going to start hitting those same kind of standards? Because that's going to be an impact when you're putting in a $30,000 septic system. It's going to have a huge impact on housing.
Quick comment on water. 70% of Portsmouth's water comes from Barrington. And from the Bellamy Reservoir, and they're about to sue to take private property in Durham by eminent domain, and they haven't heard of Dudley yet. But I am not. I'm in charge of what.
Say, Jen. Jen. Can you hear me, Jen?
Uh-oh, did they lose audio?
Can anyone hear us?
We can hear you.
I can hear you guys.
You can hear me? Okay. all I wanted to do was have a quick point of order for the presenters who know, the time you need.
We need to move.
Can you hear me or not, somebody?
Yes.
Fine. I want to know, because you know the length of your presentation and what you're trying to accomplish, and I just want to ask, how are we doing on time is my question.
Move forward.
Yeah, I would say if anyone has additional comments on this topic, to jot them down on the note cards and we can take them.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, this is the last of the 3 GIS analyses I'm going to talk about today. Excuse me. New Hampshire Housing released data on opportunity areas. There are 4 opportunity areas with data that was calculated at the tract level throughout our region. And those 4 opportunity areas are prosperity, health, education, and housing. And on this slide in the parentheses, you can see some of the different criteria that went into calculating those scores. And in each census tract, those scores were calculated between 0 and 4, and we mapped them. The map that you're looking at here on the left is taking the score for the 4 individual opportunity areas and adding them together to get a total score. So what you see on the map is the total score on the opportunity index throughout our region. And you can see that in Stratford, Nottingham, Lee, and Madbury, they ranked as having the highest total opportunity score of adding the scores from prosperity, health, education, and housing together. We also created individual maps for each of the 4 opportunity areas that you can see in the full RHNA document. Next slide, please. We then took these maps showing the opportunity scores throughout the region and overlaid concentrations of communities of interest, which we saw Rachel and Mark talk about earlier in this presentation. And what we found some unique results. And so one of those results is shown on the map on the left. What you can see here is that Durham is listed as a community with a low opportunity score for housing. What you can also see here is that in Durham, there's a concentration of people living in poverty. This is important for us to know because what this means is that where there is a high concentration of people living in poverty, there's also low opportunity for housing, which can be a major barrier to those communities of people gaining housing. The text on, what was that?
We're having a conversation here on the side about students driving the poverty in Durham.
You have no income.
But yes. Sorry, Jackson, please continue.
All good. What you can also see on the right side of the slide in the text is some of the other key takeaways we found from doing this analysis of overlaying concentrations of communities of interest on top of the opportunity areas. And you can see more maps and more information about this in the full RHNA document. Does anyone have any questions about those opportunity areas?
Cruising along.
Great. Thank you.
I'm probably reading what's on the slides and just give a little bit of context so we can kind of speed through in interest of time. So we did 4 surveys total. You can see the number of responses up on the screen. We talked to you a little bit about the data that we heard at our last meeting. I'm going to go a little more in depth on some of the open-ended questions. So what we learned about household makeup based on our respondents, you can see that about 67% have 2 adults in their household. This isn't surprising given a lot of what we've heard about people needing to have roommates, or as we've seen today, the high prices of rent and housing in the region. When asking people about dependents, most people, 67% of people who respond to our survey lived alone, followed by 15 and 12% having 1 and 2 dependents in their household. So it's just kind of some of the household makeup of respondents. Next slide. When asking about people's current housing and how they ended up there, there seems to be a theme of people having a really hard time to find either a house to buy or a place to rent, having to get creative and even offering more in rent than the rent price was just to get the apartment. People selling their homes and then not being able to afford another home and having to move into rentals was also a common theme. And I would say throughout the whole open-ended questions on this survey, affordability was a word that was mentioned again and again. Next slide. When asking people what they wanted for future housing, again, affordability was mentioned over 60 times, probably out of about maybe like 200 or so responses. Most people wanted to look to buy or purchase, but a lot of concerns with being able to stay in the region and do that because of the prices. Most people wanted something like a single family home or a condo. Those were the most popular of what people were hoping to move into in the next 5 to 10 years. There were some lesser mentions, but significant numbers of senior housing, apartments, people wanting to buy land and put either a tiny home on it or a unit with an ADU. So there were some creative options or, more unique options as well. When asking people what housing was missing, again, affordable was mentioned 104 times on this question. About 40 people thought that we needed more senior, elderly, or 55 plus housing, followed by condos and townhomes and rentals. Workforce housing was mentioned, though not as much as some of those. And there were discussions on having units near downtowns and having transit to connect people from their housing to, places they need to go for work or shopping. Next slide. When asking about what housing is not needed, most often luxury apartments were mentioned, followed by multifamily or McMansions. People seem to think that we don't need the high-rise and clustered apartments, or that like some communities have been building that recently and that we don't need more of it. Then again, as we were talking about earlier, different communities have different needs. So, considering how do we balance rural and providing more housing was also discussed. What we learned about people's plans for staying in their community, I mentioned this a little earlier. It was pretty varied. About half and half said no, they weren't gonna stay, or yes, they were. But most wanted to stay, but didn't think that they would be able to because they'd either be priced out or they, their rent would raise. And some talked about as aging allows, maybe not having that transit to get around when they don't have a car when they're older would also be an issue. So overall, the people that did want to stay were very concerned about being able to afford to stay. What we learned about people's thoughts on the role local government should play, actually a good amount believe that local government should play a role in trying to ensure that there's variety of housing options in different communities. A big discussion, and this happened at some of our outreach events too, was on how do we incentivize developers, because often they won't be able to get the return on investment that they think that they need if they're not charging a certain amount for apartments. So being creative in how we incentivize developers to offer those affordable housing options. And some other people talked about affordable housing again. And yeah, kind of how do we take those innovative approaches for developers. There was also people who believe that local government should play a role with changing and adapting zoning so that we can offer different options that may not be able to be done right now. And then some lesser options of things like rent control and ensuring workforce housing. Next slide. This was a very interesting one, and one of our posters fell down, but if you have time to look at the posters on the back wall after, we asked if people had ever been at risk of being evicted, and about 50 people said yes. And there were more, the majority said no, but people who said no were saying, they've been in situations where, if they lost their job or like they're just making enough to pay their rent. So we got a lot of interesting responses here, as you can read some on the screen. People, again, concerned with raising rents or being kicked out by a landlord who's remodeling or selling the home. or issues, people losing their jobs and being short of rent. And then just a quick overview. We had you participate in one of our events, our commissioner workshop, but we had two others. We had a housing workshop and a housing forum. We did these events in August and September, I believe. At our housing workshop, that was held with municipal planning and administrative staff. An interesting point that we heard there was actually about infrastructure and people talking about those limitations and how maybe communities can kind of come together to share some of those resources and wanting to kind of do a study of water and infrastructure in the region and see, you know, where everything is, what's available. So that was an interesting conversation that came out of that. We talked about the stigmas and jargon behind workforce housing and how we could provide more education there, you know, to show that it's very important to have those housing options. We also talked about, again, finding that balance between rural and having housing options. When we talked with you at the commissioners workshop, we learned about the importance you placed on having a variety of housing options and how zoning and land size requirements can play into this, which we talked about a little bit earlier. Again, how do we incentivize developers to provide that more affordable housing, and talking about how infrastructure dictates a lot of this. And then at our last event, our housing forum, that was with housing authority and workforce housing representatives and social service providers. We heard about the perspective of people needing resources like shelters and how we do have those resources, but often they're not enough for the need. We also talked about maybe there being resources that people don't even know about and needing more education surrounding those. We've had a good conversation about public transportation and how that plays into low income, getting to work, and having to choose housing based off of that. And we had a discussion again about maybe sharing community resources in terms of welfare. We talked about how this used to be a responsibility of the county, and how some towns have more welfare resources than others. So how can we share those? That's a really brief, fast overview of all that we heard on our survey and at our various outreach events. And we were able to incorporate that into the plan in all of the different sections. We pulled in a lot of really telling and important quotes. So if you have a chance to skim through, definitely look for those call out quotes because they really tell a story.
All right, so this is the big reveal. So as part of the project, we worked with a consultant, Root Policy Research. They're based out of Denver, Colorado, and had been also hired by New Hampshire Housing to prepare the state housing needs assessment. So it was a nice opportunity to make sure that we have some connections between the state level housing needs assessment as well as the 9 regions. As part of that contract, Root Policy generated a housing production model, and this is working towards the fair share analysis that's mentioned in the workforce housing statute. Essentially what they did is they came up with a fair way of generating what the projected need for future housing is. And so for our region, we're projected by 2040 to need 9,520 new units. The methodology that they used looked to create not just a balanced housing market, but a balanced economy. And so some of the things that feed into this production model are vacancy rates. Like how many new units do we need today to get to a healthy vacancy rate in both our rental supply and our homeowner supply, as well as moving forward, maintaining that level. And then they took, and the largest piece of this is the projected number of households. And to do that, they took 50% of the projected number of households that are coming from projected population growth, and then 50% of the new households based upon employment growth within the labor market areas. So that we're really looking at having enough housing units to support both population growth and employment sectors in our region. They further broke down the projections by owner occupied and renter occupied, and then even from there, they used the thresholds that are the definitions of affordable under the workforce housing statute. So for owners, it's a household of 4 earning 100% of the area median income. And then for renters, it's a household of 3 earning 60% of the area median income. And so those are the thresholds, and they calculated out the numbers of units we need in each of those subcategories. These numbers are available as one of the handouts for each individual municipality. We're going to kind of delve into this a little bit further because there's some additional considerations that we should be factoring in as we talk about this housing production model. So some of the things that are not included in that 2040 target are seasonal homes, replacement of units that might be considered in poor condition, and known demolitions. Now, our staff, many of you may know, go out every year and track building permits. As part of that, they collect the number of demolitions. And essentially what we know is it's very negligible. And typically a demolition permit is accompanied by a permit to construct something new. So we're recommending that we don't factor in demolitions. However, we might want to think about seasonal and poor conditions. Just kind of looking at what we have in the region, we've got a handful of communities where they do have a sizable up to 200 or 250 units that don't have plumbing or kitchen facilities. Whoa, we just stepped way to the end. So when we talk about seasonal unit growth, this is something that's really a notable item on the statewide level. At the state level, there's been a significant growth in the number of seasonal units. In our region, we've actually lost seasonal units. And I think that comports with what we're seeing at the planning board level and some of the things that we've been seeing in terms of like requests for ordinance rewrites is addressing conversion of seasonal units to year-round units. And something that we need to think about and consider here is what's driving that? Is it a shortage of housing? Is it folks that own seasonal units and just want to stay there year-round? We don't really know. And so that's one of the things that we need to kind of take a pause and say, should we be factoring this in to the projection model? And so red card, green card, should we be factoring seasonal homes into our projection model? Because they are not at the moment. All right, yes, no's, take it a poll. Wow. Okay, how about on screen? We have some, Lisa says no, Steve, Herb. All right, we have a lot of yeses on seasonals. Okay, so we'll take a look and see if we can do something.
It's a much broader question than that, though.
Yeah.
The workforce is, I've been working with some people in Boston, which is deserted because no one wants to come back to the city. The nature of work is changing such that you can work from your seaside home or your lakeside home. And it was accelerated by COVID, but it was coming anyway. My daughter works 3 days a week from home and 2 days a week in an office. They love to live on next to a pond. So I think it's the impact of change in how work is done in the region as much as anything else.
Did we get a statistic on like a number or percentage of owner occupied full-time housing versus say out of state, like seasonal condo ownership?
So we do have some ACS data. Unfortunately, the decennial census data is not available yet for housing tables. But we do have owner occupied versus renter occupied for the primary residence.
Right.
And then we do have vacancies by type, which given that it's ACS student, it's not complete, but it does give us a sense of the vacant houses, whether they're seasonal houses or for sale or rent, which is not.
How about like, I mean, what, obviously, another topic that's in the news all the time now is like the Airbnbs of the world and people just
So
flipping
that's
renting.
here.
Have
So,
we captured that in there somewhere?
yeah, and so this is not in the production model. However, it is mentioned in the document itself. You know what, this is each of the regional planning commissions, around the pie chart here. And we are, what is that? What did we make a 7th out of 9, in terms of having the least. There are only 2 regional planning commissions that have fewer short-term rentals than we do. North Country Council, I mean, it's a northern half of the state. It has half of the short-term rentals in the state.
I mean,
And only followed by the Lakes region.
because again, and sort of the so what question again, what's happening there is, there are places that are now passing legislation that says,
Yes.
you can't, we're not gonna let the Airbnbs of the world destroy us. You're gonna have to be owner occupied a certain percentage of time. So there are things that you can do to transition some of that and make that more housing. But I mean, and that's a hot area.
Yes.
So that's something where you could definitely have an impact. And, you just look at New Hampshire, like the coast, you see a lot of sort of that coastal, what used to be, seasonal beach housing along sort of the Rye Beach type coast. People are just flipping that and turning it into mini Mac mansions on the beach in, climate susceptible areas, so.
Okay. So we are getting to, it's almost 5:15. We do have a little bit to go. They say if you have like a bigger idea, you feel free to use your cards and leave them with us. Joe, you were gonna say something?
When you're back to that number, the 9,200 units in the next 18 years.
Yes.
How many units are being built today?
So that's not that many. And that's a good question, and I did not include it in here, but I will make sure that we do have it in there. I know statewide, in the last 10 years, like the 2010 to 2020, we built at about half the rate that we need to be building at. But if you go back a prior decade, it's about on pace. So like 2000 to 2010, I want to say, is close to the rate that we need to be at. So it's, and not the too distant past, we were building at the rate that we would need to be building at to meet those
So
targets.
it's not just the rate, it's the mix as well, right?
Pardon?
It's not just the rate, it's the mix.
Yes, yes. Okay, so my other yes, no question that I wanted to pose into what we should be factoring into the future production needs is to capture these units that are in poor condition. So overall in the region, we have just over 900 units that are considered uninhabitable or poor conditions, meaning that they do not have plumbing or a kitchen. Should we be adding these into the production model for the future?
Excuse me, I'm still confused about the definition.
Yeah.
So these are the ones that are rehabbed or something? Are people actually living in them or what's going on here?
People could be, yeah, so
So they're
people are
better
living
off
in
to live in
them.
a place
So,
other than
yeah,
Canada.
we've got these green ones. People are living in them and own them. The purple, these are people live in these units and rent them. The blue, the navy blue, they're vacant.
So they have like a hot plate or something, or what are they doing? This is something new.
So, yeah, so I mean, I can use a personal anecdote. I have someone that I know well that, when they were younger, their parents divorced and they lived in the family camp and they got their water from a spring and they had an outhouse. That would be this situation. They did that for 2 years until they could build a house. So that would be an example of this kind of condition.
So I guess I'm trying to understand the question about this and the prior slide. So you're saying that at present, the model excludes seasonal housing, excludes units lacking plumbing and kitchen facilities to determine our baseline housing quantity that we have?
Yeah.
And then where we need to go from there?
Yeah, so the we'll go back one slide. Oops, backwards. So this 9,520 new units, this is just factoring in no, projected new households and associated vacancy rates to have a healthy market.
It's a net new household.
Net new households, yes. So what we would be asking here is, should we add on top of that an additional number of units to generate new seasonal homes? Should we add an additional number on top of that to consider replacement of these that do not
How
have
did you
plumbing?
identify poor condition?
Hmm?
On a bad day, my house looks pretty bad. I mean, how do you identify poor condition?
No plumbing or kitchen. It's lack of plumbing.
And you think there's 100 something,
There are over 900 units in the region.
You know, like small cottages.
and almost 200 in Durham?
Yes.
Where are they?
And the building inspector doesn't know about this, I mean, in our town of Milton, the building inspector be on top of this kind of stuff. He wouldn't have an occupancy permit for a facility like that.
Yeah, it's,
I have a friend who sends me all his houses that are coming on the market. One showed up today that was, they only showed pictures of the outside of the house because the inside of the house is destroyed.
yeah.
I don't know whether it was fire or whatever, but the ad said you must be with the agent to enter because you have to wear a mask and you have to do all this. But it was advertised as a potential development project that you could turn it into a wonderful home for $165,000, 4 bedrooms, 2 baths. Well,
That'd be one
those
of
4
these.
bedrooms and 2 baths aren't usable now. So,
We
you
have
know,
a
there's a
beautiful-
potential there. So I think if there's potential, yeah,
We have a beautiful abandoned house on Mabry Road down from me. It normally costs 700,000, but no one's lived in it for 40 years. The bank holds it because they don't want to pay higher taxes.
But what,
We'll show them that slide. You gotta do something.
what do we say? If we include them,
Yeah,
that's a constant number, it doesn't change.
correct. So we take that number and spread it over the 20-year horizon.
And saying somebody's going to renovate those.
Assume,
That's the assumption.
yes.
Well, the strategic message from this is that we towns should take a look at some of those places and see what we could do to turn them into livable habitations, right? So we can add to the number of.
The sad part is somebody's living in. It is.
I know,
Everyone likes it.
yeah.
Somebody else.
Peter,
I'm interested in the number you came up with the 9,000 something housing units needed.
Yeah.
Because I look, one is obviously if you built all that housing, it doesn't stop there. Now you're gonna create a new need problem because either you've made the overall region more attractive because there's no lack of housing. So more people wanna come there, you can get into a catch-22
it gets,
situation.
yeah, so the whole point is to get to that like equilibrium rate,
Right.
of a stable and balanced market.
Right, but the other thing, I want to put that in perspective. Let's just say that 9,520 was single-family homes at an average cost of $500,000. That's my back of the envelope number that's $4,760 million. If you put that in perspective, that's 1/10 of what Elon Musk paid for Twitter. These problems are all solvable. So at some point, you're gonna come back and look at how much money, if you could get $5 billion pumped into the economy, you would solve the housing problem. It's how bad do you want to solve that? How much did we spend to build whatever, the big dig in Boston? $12 billion, right? Those numbers are all doable for the United States of America.
All right, so the next piece, tying together some of the many different things you've seen today, we did a development potential test. And so we took those 9,520 units and tested whether it's feasible to construct those, given the land that we have today, as well as water and sewer infrastructure availability. So behind the scenes, a separate GIS analysis was done that looked at buildable land. And it broke it by the presence of water and sewer infrastructure. The difference between this and what Jackson did is this did not subtract out areas that are already developed because they didn't want to exclude the potential for redevelopment or infill development. And so then they took that total area that was deemed buildable in those categories of water and sewer and said, if there is water and sewer, we're going to assume 5 units per acre in that area. And they took the total known number and the total projected. And we kind of went through this to see whether you could fit the projected need on the land that we have. The other assumptions used, if there was water or sewer, not both, 1.5 units per acre. And if there was none, no water, no sewer, use 1 unit per acre, which is a larger lot size than DES requires for septic. That's about 3/4 of an acre. That's where the 1.5 units came from for water or sewer. So first question for you here, assumptions. Do they sound good in terms of what we're using here? Green card, red card, green card. Do the assumptions sound good to you? Okay. All right. So based on these assumptions, Newmarket doesn't have enough land to meet their projected number of units. Newmarket would have just over 400 additional units that is in their production model that they would not have the land availability to provide under 5 units per acre on water and sewer. If we dropped the 5 units per acre of water and sewer to 4 units per acre, we add Dover and Somersworth, I believe, to the list that are able to meet their demand. If we went up to 6 units per acre, all units can fit. So do you want to reconsider your assumptions or keep them as is?
5 units per acre.
Yeah.
Is 5 apartments or 5 single?
Anything. Doesn't matter. 5 units per acre. Only where there's water and sewer. And think back to Rachel's presentation where she showed you 10 and 8 and 4.
Well, if there's water and storage, I think 5 units per acre is a low number.
I agree.
Yeah. Jen, I'll just jump in for 1 second. This is Dave. Dover might be an anomaly because in a good section of the central business district, et cetera, that whole area down there, which is sizable, you can see the kind of construction that's going in, and it has an enormous percentage of each building that's residential apartments because there is no density restriction, none. Okay. And I don't think that particular condition exists in many other places in our county, our area. So.
Dave, you are very right there. And you look at this, so Jackson also pulled for us what the existing densities are. And, you know, locations where there's water and sewer, we go up to 43 units per acre. And I believe those are in Dover. I could be mistaken. Yeah, it's Dover.
Yeah.
And then also locations where there's water or sewer, we go up to 20, almost 28, and that's Durham. That is the 28 here. I'm gonna guess that might be like university housing or something.
I would raise that up to probably 8 units.
Really?
Because if there's water and sewerage, I mean, Rochester's got the 6 stories building
Yeah.
going in downtown.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
I think where there's water and sewerage available,
Yeah.
The ridge is gonna have some high density at some point because there is water and sewerage is gonna be available. So I think 5 units is a low number.
So would others concur with Dawn to bump that up to be more like 8? Use your cards. Yes, yes, yes. where there's water and sewer.
I think you have, what the exact number is, I don't know, but it needs to be bumped up because it's obvious that the best bang for the buck are in a handful of places like Somersworth, Dover, and Rochester to get the most amount of units. It's just the reality, versus single family homes and things like that. It just.
Okay.
I guess I have a question about it. Does that include existing housing that might be torn down for housing that has more space?
So when we're doing the development potential test, yes.
Yes. Okay.
In the 9,500, no.
Yeah.
So it's the development potential test, it's looking at existing plus the projected need for 2040. Okay, so if we go to 8 units per acre, all communities in the region pass the development potential test. And so that kind of comes into play in this last bit here, is the reallocation of units. And so as part of being a fair share model, we have that ability to do some further shimmying of units between communities. And this is where it gets a little bit more contentious. So if we were sticking with the 5 or a lower number, we would have some units that we would have to reallocate. So this now we can cross off this one by going to 8 because all communities pass the development potential test. The other ways that we can shimmy units is by kind of placing some value statements on those production numbers as to where they should be built. And so 2 different kind of values that we could use would be to promote creation of housing where there is greater opportunity. And then also to make sure that we're promoting housing where the communities have the financial resources to support additional housing growth. And so the metric used for that is assessed valuation of the community. So at this point, I guess the question to you all is, should we do some shimmying of the numbers based upon either of these values? So this might take some units from community A and shift them to B. Part of this, the big monster spreadsheet on your table, just to give you an idea of how that might shimmy, is on the far right, you have the opportunity index, which is one of the things that Jackson shared in the map, as well as the assessed valuation per acre in the region, and just what those regional shares would be. So you can see like a community like Brookfield only has 1% of the region's assessed valuation. So some of their units, if we did this, would shift to a community that has more. Whereas, again, let's pick another random one. We're gonna pick on, let's see. I'll pick on Somersworth. It's got a little bit lower share of the opportunity in that region. And so that would shift potential units to like Barrington or what do we have here all across Lee, locations where there's greater opportunity.
We don't have any way to do that.
Huh?
I'm trying to connect reality.
So we have to do like
reality of what we
now.
can actually work with
Yeah.
what towns and developers are actually going to do.
So here's the thing. You can say, no, we don't need to do any shimmying of the numbers and reallocating. So this is a conversation that we wanted to have with you about these couple policy level items and whether we should factor these policy considerations into the production results at the municipal level. And that's part of like the bigger picture. Like if you're thinking like the academic side of this, when you look at fair share methodologies, this is part of what plays into those. It is not required.
What would be helpful to the town officials, and I was one, would be to know that we have enough but we don't have enough, and we ought to work towards it. Where they're gonna go,
Yeah,
I don't understand that piece, because, and we don't have any tools to do that anyway, other than zoning,
yeah.
and which is very hard to change in any town.
So here's one of the things that we kind of talked about in the state level. So what you alluded to is, do we have enough? And that's a piece that we don't know.
Well, do we have enough of what?
Do we have enough
We as a
units?
region, you're talking now?
So under the workforce housing statute, it says that if a community meets its regional fair share of the need for affordable housing, then it is essentially exempt from the statute.
Yeah, but based again on what?
So that's the issue.
Right.
There's no definition or methodology provided.
So let me come
But
back
it's
to the
based
definition.
upon, hold on, it's based upon your existing, the statute is considering your existing supply of housing. To be able to do that quantification, we would need to know the value of every single home as well as the rents of all of the units in the community.
I
We don't have that
disagree.
data.
I disagree. Let's use Newmarket. We're drilling a new municipal well. We're running out of water. We've had a critical water shortage every season.
But that
We
doesn't,
can make a rule that says we can't have more housing because we don't have any water. You will not be able to drink those. So I want to see resource allocation be factored into this. So resource allocation is what comes in, what goes out.
Yeah.
What are the inputs? What are the exports? What comes in and out? So you can't treat every community the same. If one community has certain restrictions on what it's able to do, then it has to reach out to the other. The Bellamy Reservoir is another excellent example. When do those towns want to fight Portsmouth for water supply?
I hear you, Peter. I 100% hear you. And I'll say, like, part of one of my kind of arguments sitting in on the statewide committee that was working with a consultant to do this was that we need to be able to test feasibility. The problem is, how do we quantify that? We don't have a way that we can quantify the limitation that you're mentioning. So the best proxy that we had was to look at the developable land area and potential and factor in simply the availability of water and sewer. But what we don't have is the information to know what the limitations are upon those water and sewer systems. So this is as close as we could get, is doing it this way. So I hear you.
It's a really hard one,
It is.
obviously. But, I think we need to be moving in the area where you're extrapolating into those values. Like developable coastline today is not what developable coastline is going to be tomorrow. And, we are doing, we have climate resiliency groups that are extrapolating what those numbers are going to look like. Now, where are those people going to move and how's that? It's the same thing. Like we did the saltwater infiltration study in Newmarket. Right? Another factor that's going to impact our just available ability. We haven't even looked at solid waste. We don't have a solid waste plan in New Hampshire, never mind Stratford County. Where are you going to put your solid waste when you have 10,000 new houses? We don't have a place to put it.
Yeah.
Right?
Local level, I know that the formula that developers use for school impact of children in a development that they're going to put in there is way off.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can think of one in particular where they said, first they started with 12 kids would be coming into school, then they went to 18. It was 42. The day that development, when it was built out, it was 42 kids. That was way beyond what their state calculation was. So I think we need to know also what population are we talking about? And certainly we have room for kids in our schools in Somersworth, but I don't think we have adequate housing for families with kids to move into. So what kind of housing is it that we're really talking about? I think is something that we need that has to go into that formula somewhere. Whether it's single family, whether it's a single person or seniors that are downsizing, or what it is, or is it a family with kids?
So I can tell you that on the back end, so they start with population projections. And then they use what's called a headship model to translate those population projections into households. Those are done based upon known data for age of the householder ages and what the typical household size is based upon the age of the householder. So they take the projections and they throw them into the model and they look at the population cohorts and go from there to generate those number of households. So the number of households here is based upon kind of the known age cohorts of the projected time horizon. So that's kind of factored into generating the households.
So Jen, my question is, to Peter's point, if you talk to the people in Newmarket, they are going to say, we don't have any water, right? Is that fair?
Yep.
So if you talk to the people in Rochester and you say, what are your plans for the next 18 years?
Yeah.
In terms of your infrastructure? No, like, let me tell you, we did that little project, names come out of my mind. We put in the water and sewer, it cost us $10 million.
Yeah.
And guess what? We ain't never getting that money back because there's only 50 people there. But the council decided to do that. So there's got to be people in all of these towns and cities that understand what these barriers / limitations are. Aren't there? So that we can build that in here. Now, I don't know how that comes out in terms of the numbers, but at least qualitatively, it says, guess what? In Newmarket, there's a limitation. In Rochester, there's none. In Dover, there is. So that we can at least get that into the document that says, I understand how you projected all this, but let me tell you what some of the realities that our towns and cities have today that are being projected into 2040 that may impact this. I don't know what that implication is, but I think we can at least identify it, can't we?
Okay, y'all have homework.
Sorry?
Y'all have homework.
I think you're on the right track with the whole modeling thing, though. I mean, you can run different models, and you can certainly run models based on acreage of available land.
Yeah.
But that's just one view. And then you have to look at the implications of once you do that, like I said, because when you bring in or you expand a population, you're changing other things like the need to build and pay for infrastructure, whether it's schools or sewer or, all the other infrastructure requirements.
All right, we're losing people, we're over time, and we still have one slide to go. Natalie, take us away.
Thank you. So just really quick, since I know we're way over, but for our last section, conclusions and recommendations, you'll notice in the draft plan that this section is still incomplete in our draft. So we wanted to get feedback from you so that we can be able to finish this up. The first component of this section is our toolbox, which for this toolbox, we partnered with an outside consultant to develop a list of just available tools that can support housing development at the local level to help each of our communities reach their goals. These, for example, are 79E, ADUs, low-income housing tax credit, opportunity zones, etc. So a pretty long and comprehensive list. It goes beyond just defining the tool. It also explores how it can help your community. What are some considerations to keep in mind? Maybe some limitations, how you can get started with it, etc. And then we have the regional next step section. And with this is the part that we want to get feedback in terms of what makes sense for your community. So what we want to know is, should we, SRPC, work on giving municipal recommendations and help identify the next steps to help address these key findings that we're presenting? And again, we welcome recommendations, any thoughts and considerations for what SRPC can do. Right now, I'll just give you one option that we had thought about. It was developing a section that looks at each community and tells you what your housing need is and what the opportunities and barriers are, and how I think maybe this plays a little bit into what the conversation that was just going on right now, and looking at what some of those barriers are and what some of those opportunities are. So let us know if this would be helpful to each municipality, and if not, feel free to share your ideas right now, but if people are short on time too, please use your index cards and leave us any comments or thoughts on how we can complete the section.
Let me just comment. Natalie, I think a lot of good discussion so far. If this slide seems to be focused a lot on making sure all of the communities in Stratford Regional, our region, are fully apprised of what each of the communities are doing, have been doing, have tried, what's worked and not worked. So we're sharing information. The ADUs is something that seems to come up a lot. That's a fantastic first step because it's obvious that everybody doesn't fully understand in every community what's worked and not worked in their sister communities. And that's the low-hanging fruit, you know, is to educate ourselves as communities, because a lot of the things we've been talking about today, they sound good, but you could get hung up for years trying to twist somebody's arm to update their rotten buildings that don't have proper sewage and things like that. You know what I mean? There's not a lot to get out of that. You know, sharing information so everybody's on the same page would be an enormous accomplishment, I think. So.
Okay.
Political quagmire. The regional planning agency should not look operational. This is an area where the towns feel very strongly about that. And if you suggest they should be doing something, somebody's going to throw you out of the room.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean it's not important to know what the other towns are doing and what options might be. But you got to be careful not to look like you're suggesting a plan for the region. Politically, as good an idea that is, it's not going to work.
What about making recommendations of things that we as SRPC as an organization can do? Some next steps we could take to assist
if
communities.
locals find it credible to the situation they think exists in their town, they might accept it. But if they see that the SRPC is intruding into their prerogatives, that becomes problematic.
I mean, I think what you're saying is Rochester seeing this number?
No one's seen this number. This is brand spanking new.
So to Wayne's point, somebody is allocating 2,000 units to Rochester.
Yeah.
In the next 18 years.
So if you
And your point, Wayne, is like, no, you're not.
So if you remember, I don't know, like a year and a half ago when we initially got the contract to start this project, I said something here. I said, okay, and it's going to include a fair share allocation, which is never popular. That's this.
Again, on the regional basis, again, it's one of my, favorite things to come back to is, since affordability is so important, we can focus on the things that improve affordability. One of those, again, lowering energy costs. So we can lower energy costs for the entire region so that people can afford to heat their homes. But there's also some tremendous opportunities on how we do that, like getting our communities to join the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire, getting them to move towards a clean and renewable energy future, getting that into new building codes. So those are things that will have a direct impact on everybody's housing picture. And so I keep looking for those things. Those are the more doable solutions than coming in and saying, oh, you need X number of housing units, you need X number of density, you need this. You can't tell people that. What you can do is, if you create those incentives where it is now more opportunities to save money, right? Those are the things we need to look for. How we say regionalization of sewage treatment plants, right? There've been plans for that. How do we look at communities that can't afford on their own to extend their water and sewer treatment plants? And you're right, and some of those other deterministic things, like I said, like solid waste is another thing out in the closet that nobody's even talking about, right? And we don't even have a plan for that.
It's being worked on at the state level. DES is doing the plan for waste management.
I just want to say that while regional fair share allocations may be unpopular, I think it's important to have the conversations and treat it as a conversation, not as a dictate, but you know, and I was thinking about the shimmying of allocation, as you called it, Jen, and I think that is more politically charged potentially, you know, and instead just recognizing that this is aspirational. I mean, I'm a former and I guess continuing housing advocate. Do I believe that by 2040 we'll come close to achieving over 9,000 new units? No. I hate to say that pessimistically, but so we got to run on aspiration. And if we set our sights low, or, you know, doctor the numbers to make any one community, you know, carry a larger burden for what may be perfectly reasonable reasons, it just invites the us and them dynamic between towns and lets, you know, some towns maybe off the hook in thinking they have any responsibility to the region. So let's all give it our best shot with the allocation that this good and solid analysis puts forth.
Main criticism of zoning in Durham was that if it's aimed to make more affordable housing, it won't, because the market will make those units expensive. Therefore, it doesn't make any sense to change our zoning because it's not going to accomplish the goal that involved.
Jen, when does this due?
Soon. So we're gonna be wrapping it up, and the goal will be the February commission meeting to adopt. So we'll be sharing it out in the new year for public comment.
I think this is great work. Thank you, staff.
The team has done a lot of work.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
But the real question comes down to what we're now talking about. All of this is nice background and it is fantastic. Now, Rochester, you got to do 2,000 units, and not only 2,000 units. These are the way they got to be put. We're going to tell you exactly.
But that's the target.
No, I understand.
Yeah.
The target is for you to do it exactly this way.
And you have no way of enforcing it.
No.
And that point up there, you need to understand the barriers. Because guess what? If we have a barrier in the city of Rochester, it says, guess what? We got no water, we got no sewer.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, what do we do now? But you know, I'm not trying to be a naysayer here, but I'm saying
Yeah.
barriers have to be identified. What happens, Jim, if we go back and say, you know what, 95-20, we can do 44-50.
Imagine if we started to factor in the property tax burden in New Hampshire as part of the discussion.
Oh, that's a whole separate.
Hey, Jen, what happens if we go back and say it's 44-50?
Pardon?
Why don't we go back and say, we've done an analysis and we think we can actually do 44-50.
You Rochester?
No.
I think it's still pie in the sky.
Oh.
What are we going to do?
I think we want to give them a realistic number that this is what we anticipate.
So let me just tell you, so it was very interesting to see, they showed us as we went through this process, different numbers of projected households that we can anticipate, based upon whether it's purely population-based, population and employment, or just employment-based. And if you look at the numbers for our region, the projected number of households goes down when we add in the employment piece. If we were just going on projected population for our region, it's a higher number of units that are needed. So what it's showing is that we've got folks in different labor markets. And so it's kind of reallocating behind the model some of the units that would have gone to our region to other regions that have the projected labor market growth.
It's interesting because
Yeah.
I hear oftentimes that people would move up for jobs, but there's no place to live.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's still a factor, but it's, and that comes back to the vacancy rate conversation. I mean, the model is trying to get to a 5% vacancy rate for renter occupied and a 2% vacancy rate for owner occupied. Those are kind of the industry standards for like equilibrium within the markets. And we're below 1% right now.
John, to your point, people want to move here, but they want to move to the seacoast. They don't want to move to New Hampshire. They want to move to the seacoast. So what are the numbers for Portsmouth region? What are their numbers?
I don't know off the top of my head, but we have them. And the other thing to keep in mind is like when they did the employment piece, they did it by labor market, not by region. And so not all of our communities are in the same labor market. So that's part of why we're seeing different shimmy.
What is it supposed to do, the analysis?
The analysis?
Yeah.
If you target for what the community can anticipate your future demand. Under state statute, the whole purpose behind the regional housing needs assessment is that we are to look at housing supply and demand at all income levels, and then be a resource for the municipal housing chapter.
So then you're supposed to behave in concert with the data that's come out somehow.
There's nothing that says that the communities have to even acknowledge this, which I would hope you would. A lot of work into it, but
at the local level, it all gets down to interest groups.
It comes down to, it comes down to like.
This isn't Russia, you know.
Your communities having the information and the data and the resources that it needs to establish policy.
I keep coming back to 40B. In Massachusetts, they do it really well. And each town knows how many, if they don't have 10% affordable housing, then the developer can get a super plan.
All right.
So Jen, isn't it the case that participating in this, I think the documents put together in the data sheets are fantastic. They're so informative. I love them. We're hung up on okay, so what do we do now? But isn't it true that participating in the program and this and that, it's a provocative program on its face, you know? It's the kind of program that once it gets down to, brass tacks and this and that, it's going to annoy people. We know that. So what do we do about it? How do we present it in a way that is helpful but not threatening?
So Rachel just pulled up the region to the south, and that helps make us look not threatening. Their projected need is 14,563.
I think if you publish a report and put it out as information for the towns as a matter of interest to acknowledge when they're doing their own strategic work, that's about the best you can do, and hope that people.
That's the purpose.
That's the purpose. But once you look like they have to do it, or you have a means of making them do it, that's when you're going to run into trouble.
That's going to alienate.
And
but we're not making them do anything here. We're presenting facts to the best of our ability.
Exactly.
For your information as you go about making decisions.
Yeah. So to that end, I think like if we have some regional next steps, which are just like benign things that we SRPC might do, how we might factor this into our programs moving forward. Peter, you've got a really good comment going back, you were talking about, we spend so much time talking about transportation. Why aren't we talking about the housing needs when we're talking about transportation? I think that's something that we could put in as a recommendation, that we could do, as a planning commission.
Politically though, if, once you put the study out, you say this is interesting, if a town then
Yeah.
pursues it and asks you, well, can you give us more information about how to accomplish what you think we might do? That's, if you're invited in to do that, I think
Yeah.
that's of interest. I can see that happening in Europe.
And the other thing that Peter is on is this talks about housing, but it does not talk about the ecosystem.
Right.
All the things that surround it.
And housing is
Water,
part of the
electricity.
ecosystem. This is what we continue to
Yeah.
neglect, is housing is part of the ecosystem.
It's not on its own.
And so, you know, the way to present the overall thing, to me, is moving towards a balance, finding that equilibrium, and then trying to achieve that and not exceed it. And, you know, it's like the same tragedy of the commons argument that's existed forever. It's like, what's our carrying capacity of the land, right? You know, we don't, no, we have to input some, we can't feed ourselves on our town hall, right? We have to import food, we have to import jobs because we don't have enough jobs. What is the balance that we're trying to achieve?
We have 9,000 more households.
Yeah.
What's the implication to the health system?
Right.
Yeah, I like the idea of the ecosystem.
There's a really great image that I want to find that was in, Heidi Aguilar, who's the lead researcher at Group Policy, when she presented the preliminary findings of the state housing needs assessment. It's kind of hard to see.
It's like a sorry word.
You can put it over that screen.
The folks online will probably be able to see it really well, but I mean, it just goes through different income levels, but also that ecosystem that you're talking about, Peter, and how none of it is, there are no linear connections. And so I thought this was a great way to see it. If you want to see this on your own, just go to New Hampshire Housing's website, look under their news and events. It's the Housing and Economy Conference, and this is popping in the way, but it's there as Heidi's presentation.
You know, and again, you can look outward to the other models. I mean,
Yeah.
there's certainly areas in Europe, you know, Finland just did another study where they require housing for everybody gets a house. No questions asked, everybody gets some level of housing, and then they work down from there, right?
That's not gonna fly here.
No, I know, but I mean, you can look at these other models too, and pick out, you know, what are the things for those that, you know, have some value.
Peter, it only takes 65% of drink to do that.
We adjourn.
All right. Well, I don't know about you guys, but I got a planning board meeting to go to.
right,
Dean, do you want to call for a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
So moved. Please, any note cards you have, please pass them along to Shayna and we'll collect those. Any comments, please feel free to send us comments. If you want a Word file version of the draft, we're happy to send it to you. Just reach out to any of us and we can get that to you. We would love any feedback you have.
I might have to write this up separate. I don't know if you've been on that chicken scratch.
Great job, everybody. Thank you for all your efforts.
Thank you.